center space at the Viva Research Center at the Jordan Sloan College of Art and Design. My name is Sophia, and I'm the Curator of Exhibitions at the Viva Research Center at the Jordan Sloan. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here. It's a great turnout, and although the storm is going on outside, so it's great. Thanks very much for coming. And also, it's my great pleasure to welcome William Latham, the protagonist of this exhibition, and to come all the way from London and to join us at this artist talk and to see the exhibition, because William wasn't able to come to here to see the preview a few weeks ago. So tonight the event here is William's artist talk, and we're also very delighted to welcome Professor Nigel Johnson to be the chair of this evening's event. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to introduce Professor Nigel Johnson, and Nigel will introduce William Latham and do a kind of contextualization of William's practice since 1980s. And Nigel actually is quite familiar with William's practice, and also I just heard this morning a story you two actually were in the same exhibition in 1986. Yeah. Okay, so that's great. So Nigel Johnson is an artist, also chair of interactive arts, and the director of the research degrees at the Jordan School. And he studied fine arts at Liverpool University, and later on did his postgraduate degree at the Slade School, University College, London. As an artist, Nigel's work focuses on the development of real-time interactive installations and digital artworks. And he exhibits his work nationally and internationally. Actually, currently, Nigel's work is on show as a master entrance gallery at the Jordan School College, entitled AESOP, an Enhanced Sense of a Place, which is an interactive installation. I think most of you probably already seen the work as a fantastic piece of work, and the installation very interesting. And today actually is the last day of the Nigel Johnson's show at the Jordan School. I hope you've all had the chance to see the work. So I'll probably now just hand over to Nigel.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Sophia. Okay, I'm going to have to do a little bit of a balancing act here, because I don't want to close William's machine down, because it'll probably shut down and you won't be able to see anything of this talk. So forgive me if I have to do a bit of a hide behind the lecture here. But I'd like to thank Sophia Howe from exhibitions at the exhibitions team, Cicely, Katie as well, and Andrew and the technical support, Duncan and Johnson from College of Art and Design, for their sterling efforts in putting this work on. And certainly with any work that involves technology, there are always issues with plugs and wires. And I should know about that because I've been involved in it for many years. So thank you very much again to the team. So I've been honoured to introduce William, and it's really great to see him again after all these years. I think the last time I saw him was at a conference or an exhibition. I think it might be in 1984. I can just quickly embarrass him by pulling out I went back through all my catalogues and actually found one of my catalogues from 1986, actually, it was. Here you go, you can see some of his form synth drawings. And I remember him getting up and actually unfurling this huge hand-drawn drawing of his form synth drawing. And I thought, wow, this is really fantastic work. And also, at the same time, when I opened my catalogue for the last 20 years, this thing dropped out as well, which is actually an invite to an exhibition preview at the Cleveland Art Gallery in 1988. And that's when we showed our work together, I think. So, if you remember that. And I'll embarrass him further with some other things a bit later on, but let me get started. So, what I'd like to do is just, first of all, just set the scene a little bit, just contextualise the era that we both sort of came up through. I think, William, you're about 4 years younger than me, actually. I'm 23. At the time, Harold Wilson, he was the then British Labour Prime Minister. For those of you in the audience that might remember him, probably very few, I should imagine. In 1963, he heralded in a new era by promising a nation built on scientific innovation and revolution. And he's often misquoted as having promised, and I quote, "a Britain that is going to be forged from the white heat of the technological revolution." He never actually used the word technological, but the sentiment is still holds true today. So, from this period between 1960 and 1980, and in particular in the UK, pioneering artists, such as William, I won't include myself in that because it's too embarrassing, but it's true, transformed and adapted the cold logic of computing into a new medium for their art and played a central role in integrating technology with culture and laying the foundations for much of what we see today in terms of new media art forms. So during this heady time of early computer art, artists needed to know how to build machines, collaborate with computer scientists, and learn the impenetrable languages of programming. This was a significantly fertile and exciting period, and when many artists were influenced by new technological developments and movements and philosophies. In particular, there were movements like systems theories, which is the interdisciplinary study of systems in general, cybernetics, with its focus on interactivity in process, artificial intelligence, or AI, popularised by John Conway's Game of Life in the 1970s, and not to mention the relationships to art historical movements such as constructivism. Also at the time, there was a general desire to capture, harness, or simulate the generative and emergent qualities of nature, of evolution, co-evolution, and adaptation. Emergence was another key word in this discourse. 3.5 decades later, the discourse of artificial life and emergence continues to have intellectual force, mystique, and relevance, now within the computers and arts communities, just as much as it did in those days. During this time, educational institutions, universities, fine art schools, and polytechnics, as they were known at that time, for those of you in the audience again who are of a similar age, had within them individuals who had the foresight and the vision to recognise the importance of this developing medium and just how culturally changing the medium was going to be. It was really at the beginning of the 1980s, and with the advent of personal computing and more sophisticated display technologies and user interfaces, that computing really did become ubiquitous. Bearing in mind that when we were working, personal computers weren't around, we had to develop and build our own systems, so it was quite a different era at that point. And I'm sure that William will touch on some of that. Understandably, the legacy of some of these pioneers and pioneering works still influence developments today, and decades later continue to inspire advances, not just within the arts, but across all subject domains, through true interdisciplinary working and practices as demonstrated through William's work and career. Other international artists and practitioners working around parallel artistic concerns at the time included the likes of Craig Reynolds, who used procedural models and complex natural phenomena such as bird flocking behaviour, also known as something called voids. That was in 1987, which promoted a greater understanding of natural systems. Carl Sims was best known for using artificial intelligence and particle systems within computer animation, and his Galapagos installation in 1997 allowed gallery visitors to interactively evolve three-dimensional animated forms. Jane Prophet's Technosphere in 1995, co-created with Gordon Kelly, was also a seminal work and was an online, real-time digital environment where users could create synthetic creatures and actually from component body parts and release them into this artificial world and see how they actually evolved and interacted. So the artists themselves described this type of work as digital ecology. Now, this evolutionary process was also described much earlier, of course, by the pioneer of mathematical biology, our very own Darcy Thompson, or Darcy Wentworth Thompson, I suppose we call him, in his seminal work on growth and form, produced mostly between the years of 1915 and 1917, I think. Quite poignant, actually, considering the commemoration that's happening at the moment here in Dundee, and which described how small changes in biological processes and natural selection can give rise to more complex forms. Darcy Thompson's collection are on permanent display in the Darcy Thompson Zoology Museum under the auspices of the University Museum Services. And we have a representative here tonight who I'm sure will be able to discuss that with anybody who might want to arrange a visit. William's own early interest in evolutionary processes can be seen in form synth. I think I mentioned that in the catalogue a little bit earlier. There's some drawings around us which highlight the manual, if you like, labour of creating these systems from very simple starting points. I think it was 1984, was that the first time you started doing these drawings? So this first development of a rule-based evolutionary system for creating complex forms from simple geometric primitives. So by applying successive sculptural transformation rules, such as scoop, bulge, stretch, and others, you could very quickly create a complex evolutionary set of forms, which would evolve. So these early works could be regarded as the genesis for the three-screen Mutator 2 triptych work that you see, installation you see next door. So William's work, it is fair to say, is inspired by natural systems, non-complex geometries, and repetition of simple rule-based steps to produce more intricate forms that create the basis of the underlying work. The work blends organic imagery and computer animation using software modelled upon the processes of evolution. Latham's solo exhibition, Mutator 1 and 2, Evolutionary Art by William Latham, was his first major exhibition to be shown in Europe. It was in Brussels at IMAR, which is the Centre for Digital Cultures and Technology, if I remember correctly. And that's the first time you've had a major solo show in 20 years, I think. And that was after the 2013 Brighton show we had as well. So I'm going to take a deep breath now, and I'm going to quickly run through William's life and career. Well, not quite, just a quick summary. From 1979 to 82, he did an undergraduate at Christ Church in Oxford. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's fine.
1982, won the Henry Moore Award to study at the Royal College of Art on animated films, printmaking, lithography, and sculpture. And I actually know that because I'm going to embarrass you again now. We have the Page Computer Arts Society Journal in 1985, actually. And in that, I'll just read this out actually. This is when William was actually at the Royal College. And he was working on animation with plotter drawings, computer-generated plotter drawings, to create an animation. And he says, a major project using computer imagery is currently being undertaken by William Latham, a student at the Royal College of Art. Approximately 4,000 blocks of hard copy artwork will be assembled to produce an animated film. Yeah. The final product should be about 3 minutes long and will cost about £300. If anyone is interested in the project or would like to sponsor and contribute to the financial help, William is looking for a sponsor. So there you go. See him after the show. After that, you were at the in 1985, you worked as a part-time lecturer at Middlesex Poly, St Martin's School of Art and Central School of Art. 1987 to 93, you were a research fellow at IBM, UK Scientific Centre in Winchester. And it was really there that your mutation work, mutation work achieved worldwide recognition at SIGGRAPH and other renowned sort of events and conferences. You had a number of touring exhibitions from 1990s onwards, and also Empire Reform, Evolution of Form, and what else was the Conquest of Form. I think I managed to dig into the library archives as well, and we are. Conquest of Form, have you still got a copy of it? And then, and then those were touring in Australia, all around the world actually, Tokyo, Australia, various venues. And then the Conquest of Form was in association with the Arnolfini Gallery in Bristol. You were co-author and with mathematician Stephen Todd with the book Evolutionary Art of Computers, which is my copy, and I'll ask you to sign it after, so I never got you to sign it. Which is still recognised as a key work in the area and describes some of the earliest animation in Conquest of Form. You then, in 1994 to 2003, you founded and was CEO of Computer Artworks Limited, a game studio, and produced the video game The Thing, which I've never played, but I've seen. That was for the Xbox, PlayStation, and so on. From 2005 to 2006, you were Professor of Creative Technology at Leeds Metropolitan University, and then you became Professor of Computer Art at Goldsmiths. And you're still working on research collaboration with Bioinformatics Department at Imperial College. Was that? Yeah. And with colleagues there on evolutionary rule-based approach to the domain of protein folding and scientific visualization and gamification. So for the past 6-7 years, you've been working with Stephen Todd and his son Peter Todd on Mutator 2 developments in terms of the artworks. You're also director of, now is it Soft 5 or Soft V? Soft V, sorry. Limited, working with UCL, University College London Neuroscience Group, and director of London Geometry Limited. And that was formed in 2011. Yeah. So finally, I mentioned that William is often quite rightly described as a pioneer, and being a pioneer or pioneering in the true sense of the word is that what you do is not necessarily recognised at the time, either by the artists themselves or the culture and society within which they work. It's usually only through the retrospective importance of what's ascribed to an artist's work after the event. In that sense, it's therefore a very timely and fantastic opportunity to review William's ongoing contributions as a true pioneer of this art form and internationally recognised artworks based on evolutionary principles. So without further ado, as you've probably listened to me for long enough, I'd like to hand over to William, who will treat you to an interesting evening. Thank you.
Thank you for a fantastic introduction. Really brilliant. Okay, so if we can dim the lights a bit. Okay. So, first of all, fantastic to be back in Dundee. I was last here 4 years ago, and thanks to Sophia, Katie, Cecily for putting on a fantastic exhibition, making the work look so great. So what am I going to talk about? Okay, so I was asked to give an artist talk, which I'm going to try and do. I'm going to try and talk about the artistic journey to this point in time, all work that including recent work plus the old work, and also how it connects with science, bioinformatics, neuroscience, etc. Also talk a touch, but it's quite a lot of material, so I may go through some bits a bit more quickly than others. Talk about how I move into computer games and rave music and things of that sort. So these are recent images, mutation structures from recent work. This is jumping back to about 1989, one of my first complex mutation structures. So this is an offspring from about 1,000 generations down, breeding these forms. You generate 9, you pick the best, kill the others, breed again. We're about 1,000 generations down. The form's looking absolutely rubbish, and then suddenly out of the darkness comes this form. It's aesthetically pleasing, and then I say, great. Then you capture it, a bit like capturing butterflies. I like this one, all the rest of them thrown away, and then you keep breeding from this variant. So ultimately, I'm thinking as a sculptor, but what I'm trying to do is harness what computers are good at to explore this vast space of aesthetic possibilities. And the idea is that out of the darkness come these strange, bizarre forms that reference the natural world, because I'm using things like spirals, branching structures, rib cages. That's kind of built into geometry, but are they're synthetic. They're natural and synthetic at the same time. So when the viewer looks at that, often there's a bit of unease because it actually looks natural. It's not natural. It was generated using a computer. And though that sort of dialogue and tension I quite like, but my main motivation is to find forms that excite me, that entertain me. So these are more recent images. We regenerated the Mutator code that I'd used at IBM and upgraded the system to Form-Go 2. So basically, this is the content of the talk. Sophia asked me to talk about the origins of the work, going way, way back to 1979 when I was a student at Oxford. And a little bit like Nigel's introduction, it's going to be chronological, explaining the journey so far and the relevance of early hand-drawn approaches which influence all the later work with computing. So jumping back in time, 1979, no mobile phones, barely any photocopiers. I was a student at the Ruskin School of Drawing. So up to this point, I'd been painting, sculpting. I was working my way through the whole 20th century art. I'd done a lot of paintings like Cézanne, and I went to Cubism, tried a bit of Jackson Pollock, tried a bit of Nero. I just kept on working my way through every single artistic style that I could. And I could reach a complete dead end. I was doing paintings a bit like Francis Bacon, but quite badly. And one day there was a dance class run by an American choreographer called Arlette Bomb, and I nearly didn't turn up, but it was an absolutely fundamental stepping point in my career. What was interesting was that she got us walking around in the Museum of Art on the top, first floor, producing dance patterns, which we then had to map out in large-scale drawings. What happened was that we were then encouraged to take these drawings and use them as kind of starting points for sculptural images. So these would become templates, which I would start to build bolsterman structures that would come off the page. So this very, very simple idea of dance moves started to result in quite complex structures. Some of them look like DNA structures. But the idea was that the 2D page was a launch pad that the structures would grow out of. And these were about 5 feet long. And one of the recurrent themes in all my work is I've never been interested in heavy chiseling things with stone. I use whatever material is kind of quickest. It doesn't matter if it doesn't survive long, it can be destroyed. So these, in balsa wood, you could build quite big structures quite quickly, a bit like Man Ray. The shadow of the form was what was most interesting, and that, a little bit like spider's webs, completely ephemeral, only there for a moment. Some of these structures were quite big, and then I would take silkscreen prints and generate 2D views of them. And some of these actually relates even now quite closely to the protein structures that we're working with Imperial College on. So here we have a backbone with spokes that are coming out the side. Then I also started to produce hand-drawn images which were a little bit like kind of American geometric abstract sculptures moving around in real time. So by this point I was making films using 16mm film, drawing every single frame by hand. Use of computing was pretty primitive. These drawings are quite beautiful in their own right. All they really are is a template for choreographing animation, and a little bit like frescoes. I would pinprick through the drawing and then take a trace, and then with a rotary pen draw every single frame. So by this point, I was already heading towards a point where I start to use software. And I started to become very good at drawing things in 3D, as a three-point perspective. In essence, it was amazing what you could just do with a compass and ruler. The world of form could be opened up just using these simple tools. And these were other stills from that time. So influences at that time, Russian constructivism, Nam Garbo, Kraftwerk. I spent all my time listening to Kraftwerk, and always contemporary music has been way ahead, like use of synthesizers. That was already influenced, the idea of using technology to create art. Moholy-Nagy, the light space modulator, the shadows we generated by the moving sculpture, but also people like Joseph Beuys. One of the key things that's interesting about Beuys is he just sets up a process, and whatever is going to happen is going to happen. The interaction between the dog and himself covered in velvet, just by putting those components in place, automatically something interesting is going to emerge. And then the other idea is that if something's accidental, you never come back and tidy up an accident. The accident has to be part of the creative process. With a computer using random number generators, that gives you plenty of accidents, things that are going to be unexpected. I was taught by Kenneth Martin, very interesting painter who used dice, control charts to generate extremely beautiful drawings. I was very, very lucky to be taught by him. Eduardo Palozzi, very big influence for a long time, also taught me at the RCA with his use of silk screening, and also his use of technology was a big influence. People like Tim Mara, but also Mary Kelly. So what was interesting to me about Mary Kelly's work, well, she had a very interesting artwork where she covered a gallery wall with all the nappies that her baby had produced that day. Again, it's this idea of process. If I'm honest, I wasn't necessarily interested in the political side. I was just interested in the idea of a rigorous use of process. Anyway, she taught me for a while. So then what happened, I was lucky to get a place at the RCA. And at that time, everyone at the RCA was doing paintings like Baselitz, Julian Schnabel. If you were doing painting, you'd be smashing plates up and sticking them on. And everyone having a lot of fun being kind of romantic artists and having lots of angst. And I was fortunate that I was a Henry Moore scholar. It was nice. I visited Henry Moore. What I learned from Henry Moore was the idea that the artist, if you're an artist, you may not want to be a labourer. When I visited him, chiseling away at all these carvings, and I think, well, the human imagination doesn't want to be held back and to spend hours and hours chiseling this lump of rock. There has to be a way of working much more quickly. But anyway, he was fantastic help to me. So what I was doing, I was spending a lot of time by then at the Natural History Museum, looking at natural forms, snake skeletons, fungi, and I started to produce these obsessive line drawings, some of which are in the show. Across the top we had a set of Euclidean primitives, a set of transforms or rules. And by the time you reach the bottom, some quite bizarre, interesting 3D forms emerge. And so very much influenced by this idea of evolution. And these were some of the etchings that were produced at that time. But what I started to do was define rules and put them into a flow diagram. So this was quite straightforward. You start off with a geometric primitive, you have these lists of transforms, a certain scale, you can use a multiplier. And this was the key bit. You use your brain as a kind of graphics device to imagine what the result of the transform would be on the geometric primitive, and you draw the result, and you go around the loop again and again. And the human brain is an extremely powerful visualization tool. You can normally imagine what the result would be of taking a sphere and chopping the top off, and you draw the result. So my friends thought I was off my trolley doing these obsessive line drawings as they were doing their huge, colourful paintings. And these were the rules. So bulge, and you had kind of pulled a bulge out of it, beak, kind of pulled out a scoop, like a beak-like form, scoop, a bit like an ice cream scoop, which sort of scoop a bit out the side. But once you started to use these forms these transforms in sequence, you'd start to get some quite bizarre forms emerging. So this was a drawing that I ended up showing in Tokyo. It was about 10 meters long by 6 feet high. And by the time it was getting down the bottom, so it was these quite rich forms emerging. And then I started to formalize the rules more. I initially attempted to take forms and make them up as physical sculptures. So when I was at the RCA, I was working in lots of different departments, and I would always try and get the technician to make the forms for me. The idea was that they would do that much better than me, but that was very unsatisfactory. That wasn't interesting. Then we had other sort of high-level rules. Where did the idea come from? Well, fractal geometry was starting to gain awareness then. Mandelbrot's use of recursion. So some drawings display recursion, the fact that you're doing repeated actions. Conway's game of life, the idea of emergent content. So Conway's, does everyone know Conway's game of life? So basically it's like a game of chess and more like dominoes, and then these larger structures slide across the page, and it's just the result of simple patterns being used repeatedly. People like Steiny and March, who using rules to generate architecture. Keith Haring, graffiti art was quite prevalent during that period. Again, as an influence. Saul Steinberg, quite beautiful, obsessive drawings. Outsider art was a big shirt at Hayward at that time. I think these were some of the drawings from that period. One of the challenges was always one would try and cheat the rules. So you set up these rules and you find yourself cheating a little bit. So this is one of my cheats. I'll just take these ideas and see where they go to. So that's one of the challenges if you set rules for yourself, whether you obey them or whether you change the rules to be better. But also, by this point, I was mainly being influenced by tantric art, this type of imagery, the mandala shapes, not influenced really much at all by West contemporary art. So Beardsley's influence, also the idea of using drawing systems like Magritte's exquisite corpse drawings, but also the idea was the page was just used to fill content. So this is the story of the life of Duke of Upton, but so you don't really care about composition. All you do is just try and use every single area on the page. The composition is entirely accidental. There's no overall design to the drawings. But also the idea of like Picasso, where he was just relentlessly being creative. And one of the other themes is the sort of competition between man and nature, where the man can be as creative as nature. And as soon as you start to build a system, there's this just wealth of potential that's implicit. But also, things like Leonardo's drawings. So taught by Keith Critchlow, who's an expert in Islamic patterns. John Lansdowne, who was one of the first persons to do choreography of ballet using software. And at this point, what I was starting to do was write bits of software which would then give me the rules, tell me what to draw. This was, again, quite a revelation, because if you build a random number generator, the computer has no sense of aesthetics. It just gives you the instructions, you have to draw them. So I started to get involved with software. This is the point that the human brain is still extremely good at some things the computer can't do. If you want to, in between two forms, retaining the characteristics of both, the machine can't do that. So this system had this idea of marrying forms. This time, this work coincided with Richard Dawkins' biomorph systems. I have to be careful what I say. He went off and got more obsessed with writing about God and things like that, in a slightly manic way. He was actually doing some brilliant work, and great pity he went so badly off track. but his biomorph system, which he programmed himself, which generate variants using very, very simple rules. And he himself also identifies the fact that content starts to emerge. We as humans can't but read these forms as alien languages or aphids. So by this point I started to write papers moving forward. But then I became aware that really to do interesting work, if you're going to get involved with software, you really had to get taken on by a corporation. So there'd be some examples like Jim Blinn, Ken Perlin, because there were no computers around. And I realised I needed to get into a laboratory. Also, rendering had started to become quite rich, and suddenly struck me using 3D graphics to produce something that could be visually as rich as a Dutch still life painting. So what happened was I went from art school to corporation. This was Hursley where I ended up. And what happened was that I, on the back of a cold call, got invited into IBM in Winchester. They had a scientific lab, which is like a kind of think tank for innovation. I showed them these big evolutionary drawings, showed them some of the software written, showed them that crazy flow diagram, and they said, well, this is really interesting, where we've got teams of archaeologists here, people working with molecular modelling, and why don't you come and join this team, and we'll see if we can implement your rules using a programming language that they developed called ESME. So there was enough of an idea there just for them to see that there was a fit. And what was interesting was at that time it was giving access to huge amounts of computer power. And the lab that we had would have a server farm sitting below. The equivalent in modern day PC is probably equivalent to that entire row, even if even more. I was very fortunate. I started collaborating with Stephen Todd, a slightly younger photo of us, still feel about the same age. And there was another very good programmer called Peter Quarendon, who was an ex-nuclear physicist. And these were some of the drawings that I produced at that time. I didn't even know what age I was, 24, something like that. And then this idea of the artist as gardener emerged. The idea is the system has the geometry rules captured, and all your job is to do is to pick and breed and see what emerged. This is a bit more technical. It had a CSG modelling system that was ready-made. It had the same set of geometric primitives, and you could union them, difference them. And we took a slightly different approach. We built a high-level language that meant you could say something was good, inbreed, kill it, or set mutation rates. So these were the kind of aesthetic guiding tools that I was going to use. And we built this grammar that had lots of all the twists and the bends and branching structures from nature built in. It sits between the choice maker and the modeler. And in essence, we took this language that Steve had written called ESME, and we then started to take a slightly different approach. We started to define transforms which would stack and twist forms. And quite quickly what we found was that once you started to use multiple transforms in sequence, you'd start to get these quite beautiful organic forms. So we had this whole language, so you could have a horn of horns, you could have horn and horns, and this kind of egg thing with a strange kind of strange horn growing out the side. It's quite easy. Things that sort of look like pond life. So there were rules that all the horns would sort of automatically be locked into place. This was another one. So we had like webs of horns, so some of the animations that one showed fractal horns, branching. And once you started to build them together, you'd start to get quite interesting forms emerging. So this one has got bump mapping, 3D texturing. This is a form I particularly like because it looks like some strange squid from another planet. But ultimately, it's just these lists of transforms being put together. But also, what was interesting, you didn't have to just produce these weird organic forms, you could actually produce quite elegant forms. So this, around Halloween each year, I'd always be breeding forms that were kind of inspired by pumpkins. I'd have a kind of pumpkin phase that I'd be quite preoccupied with. But what was interesting is that this type of sculpture is absolutely perfect. You're in virtual space, there's no errors, completely clean, beautiful lighting. It never ages as well. That's the interesting thing about this space. So this was the kind of language that we'd started to build up. Again, go to the Natural History Museum, look at natural forms to find new geometry. And even the natural world is surprisingly geometric once you start looking at it. So I was still doing drawings at that time. We had some hybrid systems where forms would grow like coral. We had this idea of death. But in essence, the mutator bit was a bit like in a kind of evolutionary fruit machine. All the numbers would spin, and then you generate variance. And so here, this is the parent, and then these are its 8 offspring surrounding it. And that's what I'd be picking from when I was breeding forms. So this was the early UI that we produced. We're starting to see a tree of forms. This is where we're mutating from simple ammonite forms. But in essence, if you've got a structure that's got 1,000 parameters, each of those values from 0 to say 10,000, you've got this kind of vast multi-dimensional parameter space that automatically exists. You've got to navigate through that space to find the forms that are most interesting. And so the mutator code was a way of navigating this space of predetermined possibilities. And we had certain rules where the machine started to learn what I was liking and would produce a number of steps to get to a particular form. This is obviously just two variables. Imagine that with 1,000. It's quite a hard problem. One of the things we did was we had 3 types of marriage. Again, a little bit. So you could either have. So the other key thing is the no limit to the number of parents you could have in a marriage. They would all contribute to the way the offspring looked. You could have random marriage, group marriage, or arranged marriage. And that was a very, very powerful tool. I guess the work does reference, these touching on things like genetic engineering. It is dealing with that type of content. So as soon as we start to build these sorts of rules in, when people would look at it, they would make these references. So though that was not my intention, that's one of the kind of accidents. It's kind of, the best art, you look at Andy Warhol, he was so close to advertising, he was commenting on that era. To me, the only way one, as an artist, you can talk about that type of content is actually by using the same tools, the same medium. But one of the key things was the computer was embodying my ideas as an artist. So these were variants that were quite high rates of mutation. This is structure mutation, where the code is automatically deleting or inserting little chunks of code. So Carl Sims, who Nigel mentioned earlier, he and I were both publishing and showing work at SIGGRAPH at the same time. He used a slightly different approach, using Lisp, which was better at structure mutation, but not so good at rich 3D forms. This was a show that he did at the Pompidou Center. The other key thing is that once you're in this multi-dimensional parameter space, if you interpolate between 2 points in it, you get a beautiful unfolding as these forms travel through multi-dimensional parameter space. So some of the movies that have been shown there, all I'm doing is picking 2 points of parameter space and moving between them, and everything the kind of choreography that emerges is just a byproduct. So the core idea was evolution driven by aesthetics, was the core idea. These were some of the forms from that time. But what was interesting to me was a bit like the inkblot test. The human will always read content into something that has no meaning. So when I'm generating mutations, there's no implicit awareness of what the form is, but we as the human bring to bear our own judgment. So when I'm picking and breeding, if I see one that looks like gnomes, I might pick and breed from that one to perpetuate the kind of gnominess of that particular generation. You can have another perspective. It's kind of like exploring a psychological landscape. So when I'm breeding forms, if anything looks like kind of a Rococo or Baroque element, I'll always breed from that one, or I may put it aside and breed from it later. If anything's got a Geiger-esque feel, I'll often like that. Anything that's got a kind of hazy pattern, I'll always breed from that one. Things that look like Greek helmets, great. You know. So this, again, my aesthetic is kind of captured in what I'm selecting or breeding from. Pumpkins, as we mentioned, also look a little bit like viruses. Plants, particularly close up. Orchids. So, arguably all my knowledge of the natural world is influencing what I'm picking, but it could just as well be, influencing, say, William Morris design. It doesn't really matter. It's all mixed up. Pond life, insects, but also things. I don't like heavy metal music, but anything that's kind of got a heavy metal note to it, I always breed from. But this is one of the questions: whether one could automate this selection process, removing the artist completely. And when I met Mandelbrot at Yorktown Heights, he had this exact question: could he use a fractal dimension filter to prune out the ones that are most aesthetically pleasing and throw away the rest? So yeah, in essence, it's an intuitive selection of forms. I'll come back very quickly at the end, this idea of removing the artist. And that's what's kind of interesting to me, is how you completely remove the artist from the entire equation so the machine can produce art entirely by itself. So why was IBM sponsoring all this stuff? Well, we developed some other applications. So this was the idea of if you're an architect, we run out of ideas, it would generate variants for you. And I showed this at the RIBA to a distinguished group of architects and told them that they'd all be out of work. And what was more, the general public could actually share in the decision process. Anyway, there was a big row at the end. And I was never ever invited back. So, one of the interesting things is like, if you start to question human creativity, people get really upset. They can be having crossbreeding, references to genetic engineering. No one really cares about that, really, at the end of the day. But if you suggest that human creativity isn't that great, it's probably just a bit of a random number generator with a few arbitrary selections, people always get really upset. And certainly, that evening was a real awareness. And actually, this tool was pretty good at producing people like Frank Lloyd Wright or whatever. So what's also interesting, which the architects didn't like, was that you could pre-cull designs that didn't fulfill green issues. The solar panel area wasn't big enough. It could automatically fulfill constraints. But anyway, that was architecture. We also did little robot figures. This was if you were working for a perfume factory and you were trying to design the next shape of a bottle next year, you could mutate the spline points. And what was interesting for IBM was we started to mutate business models to try and help businessmen predict what the future would be. So this is where the kind of art bit was certainly moving towards kind of corporate business. But they were funding my exhibitions and I was traveling around the world, so that was fine. I didn't really mind. But it was a very rich period of time, quite competitive. Carl, Alan Norton, these great people it was fantastic that you get to some show now, and then the following year we put into a feature film. It was a very, very exciting period of time. Scientific American wrote about us, and everyone was writing books. This was the exhibition I had that Nigel mentioned. So I'm just conscious of time. I'm going to try and get through these. The exhibition in Tokyo. Okay, context of art. Well, basically, when I at IBM, I found myself back in a kind of Renaissance situation. So the 20th century art was kind of taking everyone off on this kind of jaunt going towards I don't know what. This is far more exciting when you've got artists and scientists, mathematicians all mixed up together. I was able to fulfill my aim of trying to emulate Dutch still life painting. That we spent hours and hours painting these things by hand. We steal lighting models from Rembrandt. That was the only thing that I really handcrafted was the lighting. But also influences of people like Max Ernst. Even though I was using random number generators, artists like Max Ernst, it's true, we're using randomness extensively. So Max Ernst was taking rubbings. George Van Tonglen is interesting because all his sculptures were equations. Roberto Matta, who I got to know, fantastic last surrealist art we met in Monte Carlo at a conference, and he ended up buying two of my drawings, which was great. But he would start his painting by throwing a bucket of paint at the canvas. So this idea of randomness is prevalent in art. The beautiful paintings are very, very underrated. So, a bit on contemporary art. Well, I have quite strong feelings about contemporary art. To me, Jeff Koons, all that's great, but it kind of dies in the auction room. With this type of computer, which is ready-made, is the starting point for kind of endless content. So the ready-made trap is very, very seductive, but ultimately it leads absolutely nowhere. But if you consider the ready-made as the vehicle, then the content will emerge from it. So what happened next? Well, I suddenly found that my audience wasn't the people I was really trying to show work to. I had gained this huge problem following and culture. And so my imagery was kind of being used as kind of, I guess, people would take drugs looking at my imagery, basically. Once I belonged to IBM, this was all happening. And so what happened then? Well, by that point, IBM had started to scale back its research groups, and they suddenly said, well, you've got a choice, you either become an academic, or we give you some boring job at IBM, or you go off and form a company. And I thought, well, I'll go and form a company. And so I then set up a small studio in Soho, top of Manhattan, and I moved from art and entertainment. But then what happened was that I found that bands like Shaman approached me and said, we love your work, why don't you direct all our next videos, do all our album covers, you kind of got carte blanche. So I'd always been interested in music, techno music, and so the Shaman were the biggest advocates of use of ecstasy. They've got a lot of trouble advocating ecstasy on top of the pops. And what was interesting was they claimed that when they took a particular drug from the Amazonian rainforest, they always saw my forms. That was the other reason why they liked my work. So anyway, then I had a lot of fun. In fact, I started working with them whilst at IBM, and I had a very bright student who found a way of linking up the entire IBM network across the UK to render one of the Shaman's videos. And the head of PR came down from London and said to me, look, by the way, the IBM is directly associated with Shaman ecstasy taking. I'm going to lose my job. Please stop. So I was already looking at kind of commercial world at that point. Going from Winchester to Soho was interesting. Did all sorts of album covers. People would say, why did you do that? Weren't you selling your soul, William? You're a great famous artist. And I said, well, why not? It was interesting. Rave culture, to see where it went. And then what started to happen was that we got interest from big publishers. So Warner Brothers approached me to produce a PC version of what we've done at IBM, so that this is like a kind of organic screensaver that you could have running on your PC, and it generated quite beautiful organic graphics in real time. This was a huge success. It went everywhere, and then Windows 95 included it, and Windows 98. And people would stop me in the street and say, I love organic art, I run a garage, I've got it running on all my machines, it looks beautiful. So yeah, definitely it had a wide audience. At IBM I'd learned enough about how to do deals and operate in a corporate environment, so it was no different particularly dealing with Warner Brothers rather than dealing with IBM. And with this package we could produce whatever scenes they wanted. I had a couple once that had broken up, and they said, the only thing we've got in common now is organic art. The girlfriend's got the dog, and I want to send my girlfriend scenes using organic art. And it was really interesting how engaged people get in software. This was all before tablets, it was all just on PCs. Then by this point we started to veer towards games. I was employing about 30 people by this point. Again, trying to get the genetic mutation idea. We did other album covers. Then Universal Studios rang me up and they said, we always loved your work at IBM. Film The Thing, which I also loved. Why don't you do the sequel to the film of The Thing and start the game where the film finished, but make sure you get lots of your IBM organic type forms in there. And then we worked on this project for about 2 years. It was number one hit, I think. So by then, it was interesting, certainly working with Universal Studios. So Vivendi ended up buying Universal. These are some of the images. So by this point, I was well and truly into the entertainment space. The nice thing about entertainment is it's very, very simple. If somebody's successful, it sells. In the art world, it's far more abstract if somebody's successful. Then I finished with that company and then started another company. I did lots of due diligence for different people. Special film guarantors. My role in this was to go to creative teams that had gone off track and get them back on track. So this is all kind of boring stuff if I get through. So I was a kind of poacher turned gamekeeper. And I was quite good at working out where creatives were going wrong and unraveling what the problem was. So then, jumping ahead, I became a professor at Goldsmiths. I finally ended up back in academia. In hindsight, my second or third option, go back in academia. Probably what I should have done. Probably built up quite a well-known reputation in the mainstream art field by then. So then what happened was, so the challenge here was that, a bit like reforming a 70s rock band. Everyone knows all your work from way before, and that's really what they're most interested in. So how do you come back after you've been away for a period of time, sold your soul to Hollywood, and how do you start producing anything interesting again? So it was an interesting point in time. There's no advantage in doing really interesting work early on. So I said, well, why don't we... So by that time I reconnected with Stephen Todd and his son, Peter, who was a very good programmer. And we then said, well, look, why don't we just... It's a little bit more complicated because Lawrence Kelly had been a big fan of my organic forms. He worked for Bioinformatics Group. And he said to me, well, look, some of your forms look like protein structures. Why don't you come and do a joint project with us? Let's see if we can visualize and model some complex protein structures. So we put together a team, a mixture of Goldsmiths people, bioinformatics people from Imperial College. And what was interesting, once you start looking at the protein space, they are surprisingly simple. There are barrel-like forms, there's a kind of set of different protein structures. And what was interesting was that Lawrence highlighted to us there was a correlation between the protein structures that were most aesthetically pleasing and the ones that are being most robust. There was a need for aesthetics in the protein modeling space. So the first thing we did, we rewrote the Formgrow code in Java, and we had to resurrect all the transforms. And the idea was, in the real world, we had codons, amino acid proteins. In the Mutator world, we've got the complete set. But on the left-hand side, there's quite a lot of areas that very little is known about. So the idea was that we try and bring these two systems together and see whether interesting things would emerge. And there was equivalence. I won't go into too much detail, I'm sure you just get the idea of this. So we started to take codon data using simple lookup tables. We translate that into a variety of transforms and numbers. And this is the transform table, a mapping table that we designed. We also handle numbers. So what we would do is read in the codon sequences, and it would just literally kick out Formgrow code, which would then define complex 3D forms. So there's a kind of a way of taking numeric data and producing 3D visualizations. And so these were some of the earlier ones we did, like mouse keratin. So the idea is that you would have a visualization, and the key idea was that you would pick up on genetic defects by actually seeing quite quickly visually whether the form was deformed or not. And then we had this idea of junk code. So what was interesting to me was that we were bringing the software closer to the natural world, which had always been the inspiration. The idea was that with sickle cell, it would pick up the anomalies and represent that visually. We wrote a paper on that at that time. But a little bit like the Wishler form, you could traverse multi-dimensional parameter space in the same way. What eventually happened was that we started to get more and more involved with games, and then we ended up very interesting, very, very creative. This was some of the whiteboards that we'd be producing. We also did some work with mathematicians on mutating a particular set of equations. Then we won a big grant with the BDSRC, and these are some of the visualizations that we've been working on. And we also did a 3D version of the house thing, which we've always been wanting to do. It's like a crazy architecture. It does it in seconds. It doesn't cost you £20,000. So this is more recent work where we've been mutating fractals. So I've got a very bright student called Lorenzo working with Stephen. And what we've done here is we've tried to automate the aesthetic selection process. So basically what we're trying to do is reward things that I like. So asymmetry is rewarded, the number of holes is rewarded, the fractal dimension is plugged in there. And so what we're trying to do here is mathematically capture the rules that an artist or designer would be using when they're looking at the 9 variations, which one they pick. And so these are some of the rules. And one of the interesting things, it does look for faces. You can't find witches' faces, but it will actually find quite photographic faces. So what we're using here is computer vision techniques to do the sampling, some removed from the equation. So here we see it being used on some of the more organic structures. And it's surprisingly good at picking the most aesthetic one. What's interesting about it is revealing what the machine cannot do. So what the machine doesn't understand is if there's something in here that looks like a griffin or a seagull. It has no idea of content or culture. But things like design, balance, things that you can have a nice, clean mathematical rule it can work on. So that's one of the areas we're working on now, is how to get the machine to recognize content, not just clean design. And that's kind of one of the reassuring things, is that humans still are good at some things. And then so it has a number of points of interest. Sorry, I know I've gone way over time now. I'll try and finish quickly. So fantastic show work here. The big curtains, very, very recent. The idea is, again, coming back to this idea of things being ephemeral, sometimes they look invisible. Started doing big drawings again. Having a bit of fun with that. So had to learn to draw again. Resurrected the old rules. Then I've been doing drawing workshops where I've got other people doing big drawings, coming up with new rules. This was a group in Brussels. Some of the Mutator code, I'll skip over that. So, one of the key things, moving from art to science, this is the final slide. So why get so close to computing or so close to bioinformatics? Certainly a lot of work, and to learn all this stuff, form teams. So what's interesting is Capability Brown, in his landscape, every single tree in this scene has been put there by hand. It's not by chance. There's a drawing that decides where every single object in that scene is going to go. And the basic idea is that maybe man has got a kind of future vision of what nature should look like. If we're going to be redesigning it, probably aesthetics or artistic ideas are going to have a big influence. And certainly with the protein docking, aesthetics comes up a lot. So the idea is if you're going to have your artists stuck away in garrets, there's no way that they can interact with the scientists in this kind of redesign process. It's only by building software together that you can build some aesthetics into those systems. And that's the final talk slide.
William, for that really fascinating insight into your working methodology. We've got time for a few questions. I'm hoping that some of you might have been thinking about a few things while William was talking, but I've got one I can start off with. I've lost it. You spoke about this notion of being a gardener.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that? Explain what you mean.
I'm not very good at gardening myself. I have no interest in gardening in the real world. I guess the idea of using the idea of a gardener was quite deliberate. It was an idea that everyone could understand. So, and the idea that you would be deciding what was successful. The foods look like flowers a lot of the times. In some ways, people said to me, well, really what you're doing is like crufts, you're breeding dogs. It's more like things being crossbred. And I found that people weren't very comfortable with that. What do you say? People like dogs so much. Some people do. So the idea of gardening was a way of presenting, interacting with the software in a kind of more friendly way. But probably dog breeding is probably a bit closer the way we're working. But it was a nice idea. And I think one of the challenges, I think, if one's working in any field, is you need to give some names to things. That's one thing I've learned over the years. If you're working on a project, to give it a name early on, make sure it's a decent name, not too long, make sure you get the URL, and then everyone starts believing it. So, as say, when you're operating as a gardener, that sounds good. With a computer, yes. And that was enough. They didn't really know any of the detail. It was just an idea that people could understand. So it's not a perfect way of describing it, but it is the idea of presenting the interaction with the machine as being a little bit less clinical.
I have two questions. First question is that in generative art there's very often this confusion about the process and the outcome.
Yeah.
So what's the actual art? Is it the creation of the process, which is what you would do, and I would think that's also where the creativity is?
Yes.
Or is it the actual outcome? Is that the
Could you elaborate a little bit on
Well, that's a very good question. Yeah, the outcome is almost accidental, and you lose interest in it as soon as you've produced it. So I guess that's like a snapshot. It's like a bit like a holiday where you take a few snapshots, so kind of record of the path that you might have taken. I would say the artwork is the whole thing, the software, the intellectual debate, people I've got plugged in, working with me. So argue that, how you position that in art, that becomes like performance art. The whole thing is the artwork. It's an interesting debate because the content is just accidental.
But at the same time, you emphasize the kind of, when you do the selection process or the content, then you focus on the outcome and say, this I take and the other stuff I throw away. So the outcome.
So it's when you're picking and breeding, so from my point of view, when you really focus, it can be like a bit of a kick, you suddenly find an interesting form. It might have a slightly Freudian dimension to it. It might be very symmetrical and beautiful, it doesn't really matter. And then it's suddenly appealing, and then you think, let's see where this goes. And then you maybe, and Carl Sims also talks about it, then you hit like a patch of dead space. Everything is great little lumpy shapes, you can't see anything interesting. And then suddenly you reach this kind of vein of content. And what's interesting, you never, this is kind of unseen content. It's a bit like being explored. And some of the forms might look like alien spaceships. From my point of view, I quite enjoy that that kind of zone one gets into. And then the forms, if they're interesting, normally other people find interesting as well. But it's a good question. What is the artwork? I don't know. But, I guess most artists just churn it out and then sell a bit. I'd say probably most artists, it is a kind of process.
Can I ask a second question? Has to do with it. Is this desire to get rid of this notion of creativity that we talked about? And I have the feeling you're playing with it because I'm sure you think of yourself as being creative.
Yeah.
And it's just maybe shifting to a different level, which is again relates to the creation of the process more than the creation of
so I think, so it's an interesting question. So we've already had this idea of the human as the genius, the misquoted Noble Savage idea, the idea that humans are just brilliant. And I think if you try and make the machine to be as creative as the human, you learn a lot about human creativity. That very process forces you to look at what does it mean to be creative. So that when you produce these forms, it couldn't see a witch's face or a griffin. It suddenly revealed that's one thing that humans still does extremely well, but quite a lot of the other aspects it can do very well. I think up to this point we've had this idea that humans are excellent, they're fantastic, but actually there's a growing feeling maybe, with driverless cars and things like that, with robots will be a lot safer than a lot of the loonies driving around that I meet on the road, and maybe the machine is going to be better than the human. There's this growing feeling that actually humans may not be as excellent as we thought, and maybe it's probably going to be some hybrid between man and machine that's going to really enable us to do things. But I don't know. But I think what I'm interested in, the very fact that I'm trying to simulate human creativity means I'm very interested in it as well. But I think it probably is overrated, human creativity.
But doesn't that, I think you said people usually get very upset when you present this sort of thesis, and I think the reason for that is that our whole notion of art is really based in aesthetic theory of enlightenment, which puts an emphasis on the individual and the expression of of the individual. And the moment you challenge it, you basically challenge the foundation of what we think for an artist.
But yeah, I think already use of statistics, widespread use of statistics is already eroding that. And I think definitely I'm a great believer in challenging mainstream art, and I think that's just completely stagnated. And the kind of gallery auction system has just absolutely brought it to a kind of grinding halt in terms of innovation. So, but no, it's a very, very, very good question. I think even someone who's very creative is using charts. Charcoal breaks, or they read a particular book at that point in time, and then that influences the content. That's all charts. It's driving a lot. And we choose to dress it up as being like a masterpiece, but actually it's just a chain of events that have just resulted in this particular artwork. But I guess because I've been working with software so long, I tend to think in a slightly more clinical way, I guess.
Don't you think that what you're doing is human creativity? I mean, to me, it almost exemplifies human creativity. You're so creative that you have systematized rules for creativity, so that now you can take that and stand upon it.
Yeah, I'm dumping the work onto the machine, trying to free up my time to then work on other stuff.
Yeah.
So arguably, yes, you could have a completely different view of my work and say it's very, very creative. But one could just have a completely different perspective on it. When I'm reading forms and it's very creative, I enjoy it. But it's an interesting question.
Have you tried using these forms like not a finalized creative product, but like a basis for future imagination? Like you see a form, then this form can be, or this texture can be used there somehow in some way, and then I use it like in my imagination without computerized systems, just in some way. I don't know, computer games like deal with the buttons.
So do you say take something and then take it into another?
Like using these forms like the basis for imagination, not like a final form.
I've done a couple of times schools workshops with young children who write poems on these forms, and that's very interesting. We take one of these forms, then people have to write something, a short story or a poem around that, and taking it into another domain is definitely interesting.
I mean, not in the other domain, but in the same domain. But like when you do a program in a computer, you are limited to some generic rules, generic stuff. But
yes.
You can use this like model yourself and to change it, adjust it in a certain way so that it goes in a certain direction.
Okay, so now I understand your question. So the question is, which is a very good question, is whether the very process of software writing conditions the way that you think. The software, by its very nature, has constraints. So I had a conversation with a mathematician the other day, and I said, well, if we only think about maths, isn't that a very blunt tool for understanding what's really happening out there? It's conditioning the way you think as a mathematician, just the very fact that you're using this framework, if you like. So it is true, the great tendency if you're writing software is to do things that work well with programming, and actually harder things, like content recognition, things like that, go against the grain of software. And I think that's a interesting problem. And you say, well, let's switch to another language like Lisp or kind of AI-focused language. And people do switch languages to pick up the nuance that that language offers. But you could say, arguably, the fact you can write software is influencing the way it's preventing us from doing certain things that we probably would like to. Okay, great.
Any last questions?
I just have one question which I think is quite related to the last one. It was thinking about when you were describing the process of creating the early drawings, you describe it as creating the rules to then break, to either follow those rules or break those rules. And then I guess that's quite interesting, but if you've got to follow, how do you feel like through using the software which we have to create
It's a similar,
Yeah, it's a similar question.
it's a similar thing. You suddenly realise that you want the software to do a lot more than it is, and then you've got to get that coded. So yes, you can be frustrated by the tool set.
Maybe that's the creative element. as
But
well.
also, what's interesting, you can become a little bit complacent as well. You've got all this stuff and say, well, I'll just do more of that. So that's the other risk, which is one of the reasons I'm starting to do a lot of work with neuroscience people at UCL, just to try and pick up ideas from that domain. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I overrun.
I think it's a good job. Appreciation again.